Hey guys, Tarke here, and I'm doing something a little bit different today. Since we have the upcoming expansion coming out, and we will probably expect some skill reworks, and since GGG loves them threshold jewels, I decided today that I would offer a few suggestions on ways to improve or change some skills which currently don't see much use in slightly interesting ways rather than just standard fix AoE, fix damage. That being said, I do think that a vast majority of skills could be fixed just by giving them a sizable AoE increase. So, I'll quickly go through the skills that I've selected, and then we will do some visual demonstrations with some clever sort of like computer tech stuff on how I would improve them. This is my list. So I tried to select a few interesting skills which don't really see much use, and let's just quickly go down what I've selected. Infernal Blow, Static Strike, Sweep, Bear Trap, Phase Run, Mirror Arrow, Chain Skills. This is a general idea that a friend of mine had ages ago, which I just think is really good and should be incorporated. Arctic Breath, Ball Lightning, Flame Surge, and Lightning Warp. Okay, so just to get completely off the bat, so let's go with Infernal Blow. For anyone who doesn't know what Infernal Blow does, it is a attack AoE melee skill. It converts 50% of your physical damage to fire damage. It is a name lock skill. And the problem with this skill is, oh, look at this amazing computer graphics. It actually has very good AoE, and it has a few quite cool things about it. So if I'm here and I want to hit this mob, I can punch this mob. When this mob dies, he will then do a massive explosion, right? Seems good. Name locking has improved a lot in recent years. However, it also has some very big issues. So let's say that, let's say the pack starts over here and I want to hit this mob. I need to walk on over. I need to go boop, 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 kill this guy, which will kill these mobs, and then I need to walk over to hit this guy, which will then kill these mobs. And this is one of the big issues you have with name lock skills. So, other than just the obvious, how do we, fix the skill without just removing name locking completely? Well, we kind of remove name locking, but keep it in an interesting way. So the way that Frostblade targeting works is, if anyone has ever played with Frostblades, Frostblades is actually a name lock skill, but it has a very large weapon range. Because of this, what happens is you can attack in any direction around you in sort of roughly this far, and then when you connect to the mob, the skill then does its thing. So one of my suggestions, in a kind of an interesting-ish way to make Infernal Blow feel more usable, is simply just make a threshold jewel, which is Infernal Blow gains 5 flat weapon range. Now, I'd rather just bake into the core skill, but GG likes threshold jewels. What would this really do? The core skill would feel exactly the same. It would still be a name lock skill. However, you would suddenly get to punch mobs from far away. So I can now punch this mob here from where I'm currently stood, causing an explosion, killing all of these guys. I still have to walk on over a little bit to then punch this mob, for example. So it still keeps some of that intrinsic gameplay, but it makes it far more usable and approachable, and makes a pretty cool skill with very nice visuals, very satisfying gameplay, actually playable for a vast majority of people. So that is one base example of how I would improve the skill in an interesting-ish way. Pretty straightforward. So let's go into Static Strike. Static Strike is a skill that I've recently played, and is another name lock skill, and name lock doesn't feel that bad when the AoE works. So with all of these things, you either just crazy buff the AoE, or you mess with the way their targeting intrinsically works. So what would I do to Static Strike? So Static Strike, it has a pretty decent base damage. It converts 60% of your physical damage converted to lightning damage. And then after a delay, it does a big explosion around your character. And it gains some chance to shock and some radius with levels. So the main issue Static Strike has is it's very comparable to, for example, Earthquake. The way that Earthquake works is you punch the floor, then after a brief delay, an explosion happens. The way that Static Strike works is you punch a mob, then when you connect to the mob, an explosion happens. The important difference being is you don't get the after explosion with Static Strike unless you're physically connected with a monster. So Since it is a lightning skill, and I think lightning is an element in general which doesn't really have that much going for it, and since the skill has shock built into it, one thing which could maybe work and could maybe be interesting, obviously you'd have to tune damage numbers on all of these things and AoE overlapping, is, for example, in the base version, if this was a static strike character, it would hit this mob, and then it would go 1, 2, 3, circle around my character. And that's literally the AoE of the skill, and it has similar issues with Infernal Blow, where we have stragglers left behind us, stragglers left in front of us. So we then walk on over, boom, 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 hit this mob, 1, 2, 3. Now these guys are dead, but these mobs are still behind us, now we have to walk backwards, 1, 2, 3, hit, delay. Okay, these guys are now dead. It makes a skill which is visually very cool, and just kind of a pretty interesting skill in general, feel basically useless because of the way that targeting works in this game, and because of the way it works. Name locking isn't the issue. If it had insane area of effect, then you would hit this mob, and then after a brief delay, everything would die. But GGG doesn't like massive AoE, so we can't fix it that way. So what are some other ways that we could fix it? So instead, we hit these mob, and since it is a lightning skill, and lightning is well known for having these very high ranges and chance to shock, let's say that after the delay, we then have the explosion hitting these monsters. One thing you could do is have it so shocked monsters from the secondary effect, you could have all shocked monsters or only 1 to 3, then do a small AoE around them. So you kind of get like a small aftershock effect with obviously very reduced damage. And it'd be one of those things where you would have to change the amount of targets it hit based on how overpowered you want it to be, or how you scale the damage. So, for example, in this situation we've hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 monsters. You could do it so that every mob then does after a short delay. So this, 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 this. After additional sort of second, they all then do a small circle around them. So like this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. It would sort of add a mini Herald of Ice effect. Anyone who uses Herald of Ice in crit builds know that if you add Herald of Ice to your build, you can sort of slightly increase your AoE by making these additional splashes. By having these kind of like delayed chain reactions going on, it makes it feel more unique than just Earthquake, for example, and it slightly improves the AoE while still keeping the core gameplay fairly similar. It buffs the AoE clear, but doesn't make the single target absolutely insane unless you can surround stuff correctly, which you can't really do outside of our breaches. So it doesn't necessarily make it some super crazy boss killer, but it makes it a more interesting skill. And before you say, but Tarke, this would be so incredibly OP, it's still not killing these monsters or these monsters. So these guys are still alive, these guys are still alive, we still have to walk on over to hit them. But it makes it feel a little bit more interesting. So for example, in this case, we would have to walk on over, still name locking, so walk on over, hit you, we then do this, and again, it would only do the after effect against shocked enemies, so you still have to shock, so you either need to go high shock chance if you're non-crit, or be a crit build. And then you could have it so, okay, well, this guy will then explode, again, after a delay. Don't make it instant. By keeping the delay in there, it still gives the monsters time to move or react to you. You don't want to make it completely overpowered, and it makes it feel kind of unique to the skill. So these guys would do a little bit of AoE overlap on each other. So these guys would probably be deado. And this guy might hit this one, right? You've still got to walk over to this guy, and you've still got to walk over to this one. So you're not suddenly like doing massive AoE screen clear, but it makes the skill feel a little bit more interesting. And with many of these skills, they're so nearly usable. All they need is a little something to make them feel a little bit better. So what's next on the list? Sweep. Now, Sweep is a skill I actually really like. I know Hedgie really likes it. It's a skill which just feels good, but it intrinsically has not very good damage, and absolutely terrible AoE, and has an less attack speed modifier. So, if you don't know, you swing a two-handed melee weapon. It has to be two-handed. In the current state of the game, that already puts it at a large disadvantage when it comes to movement skills, seeing that means you basically have to use Leap Slam unless you have a lot of attack speed. Leap Slam with two-handed weapon feels pretty trashy, so it's already a very big disadvantage. It then has a very small area of effect, and it has a chance to knock back enemies on hit, and has this less attack speed radius. So if we jump back on over to here, so in this case, Sweep would literally hit like that. if you start stacking crazy AoE, it would maybe clip those monsters. In this case, it would clip this guy and this guy alone. Now, you could say we could fix this by giving it screen-wide AoE, but no, I don't think that'd be too interesting. So, one thing I would suggest, since it has the knockback mechanic inbuilt, again, it has that chance to knock back enemies, why don't we make something which makes the knockback feel a little bit more interesting, or at least slightly more important to sweep itself. So, my suggestion would be that you add a threshold, where all monsters who are knocked back by sweep, they get like a stagger effect. That's just a new thing I've called. Think of it like MAME, you know, they start adding these new secondary effects. And just have it that staggered enemies then take 5% more damage, or have staggered enemies have reduced stun threshold. Add some kind of secondary mechanic, and then you could, if you in the future, you could then start printing out into more unique items, but for now, let's just say sweep. Enemies knocked back by sweep then have 5% reduced stun threshold. Now, is this suddenly going to make sweep the most powerful skill in the game? No, but if you're now someone thinking about, oh, I want to make a stun build, and you don't want to just go for Ancestral War Chief or Heavy Strike, maybe this would start opening up some new interesting ideas. So for people who want to mess around with stun shenanigans, they have this AoE skill, and every time you knock back an enemy, the enemy then becomes more likely to be stunned. And thematically, that kind of makes sense. It doesn't make it a better clear speed skill, but it just makes it a more interesting skill. And trust me, people will build around it, because people constantly tell me, but Tarke, how do I make a Tidebreaker build? It's just something which just adds a little bit of extra spice. And at the end of the day, if you don't want to make these old skills amazing, since we need bad skills for new players to learn what good skills are, it's just something, okay? Okay. So, next, I realize this is going to be a very long video. Bear Trap. Bear Trap is a skill of old. This used to be one of the greatest single targets in the game. Funny enough, going way back to old school, your Freeze Pulse or your EK, that's it. People used to use Bear Trap for single target. So, what does Bear Trap do? Other than annoy you when you get hit by that one Bear Trap Rogue Exile. I hate you, by the way. Throws a trap that damages and immobilizes a single enemy. So, it's a trap skill. Traps feel kind of trashy because traps. It does some damages, and it locks an enemy in place. As far as I'm aware, the only way to lock enemies in place, ignoring like stuns and freeze, is Bear Trap and Val Rain of Arrows, and it's a very unique effect, which in the current state of the game, where you just clear speed, doesn't really do anything. So a very simple solution or offer, I would say, to make Bear Trap feel a bit more interesting, is add a secondary effect or a bonus to locking enemies in place. So for example, enemies rooted by Bear Trap either take more damage or they have increased duration of ailments upon them. This suddenly makes it very interesting for builds which, again, they want to stun bosses, they want to freeze bosses, they want to do cool things with poison. These are things which won't suddenly make it this amazing clear speed thing, but it might then make it an interesting option for other builds. The way they changed the Blight Threshold jewel to suddenly give more damage to Chaos builds opened up all of these really cool things which you would never use for map clear, but it makes Chaos builds a little bit more interesting if you want it for bosses. So you could do the same thing for this. If you're an ailment build, or you're a freeze build, or you're a stun build, if you Bear Trap the boss is then rooted in place, and what's rooted in place, ailments or status effects have a 20% increased duration on them. Doesn't completely break the game, you'd still have to fit it into very niche builds, and those builds generally are so niche that they're not going to be like map clear. You would never use this map clear, you would only use it for certain boss encounters or people who want that weird thing. It just makes it a bit more interesting, it opens up some options without changing the core fundamentals of the skill itself. Next, Phase Run. So, this is something which kind of just comes to the current state of movement skills. I would like GGG to nerf stuff like Shield Charge Wing Blades, but it probably won't happen. So instead, let's offer some interesting alternatives for the build which cannot use Shield Charge, Whirling Blades, etc. So, I've recently been doing a lot of stuff with Smoke Mine, funnily enough. Smoke Mine isn't actually that bad when you get used to it. Phase Run, however, is kind of one of those things that even if you want to fit it in your build and you are used to it, it's very finicky. So what does it do? Gain a buff that makes you faster, harder to detect, and grants phasing. Seems good. Phasing lets you walk through enemies. So, you get up to 39% increased movement speed, you get up to 30% more melee physical damage, and it has a base duration of 1.8 seconds, and then when you hit the monster, it's kind of done. It's just like, boop, 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 boom, okay? So, performing any skill replaces the first buff with a short duration buff that only boosts melee damage. So you press phase run, you get the speed buff, you then use another skill, you lose the speed buff, and you gain this like buff to your melee damage. Now, this is something which they're like, we're gonna make this for melee builds, because melee builds need help. The problem being, is if you're a melee build, you've got good movement skill options. The game doesn't need damage boosts anymore. The game mostly needs to diversify movement options. So what I would suggest is you make a threshold jewel for phase run, which changes the way that phase run works almost completely. So what I would suggest instead is that instead of when you perform an attack or a skill, it removes the buff giving you this more physical damage, I would say that phase run persists for the full duration, but when you use a skill, you do 30% less damage, and this is a generic thing. So if you use phase run to move, you'll move faster, but the second you use another skill, you have 30% less damage, and you could have it for the next 3 attacks. So you go, that seems terrible, but think, you're not going to use this for bosses, you're only using this for map clear. What builds would use this? Wanders, bow builds, staff casters. Basically, Wanders, bow builds. So Wanders and bow builds are known for having insane map clear. Wanders and bow builds are known for having really good damage. Wanders and bow builds could do with having some more movement options at the cost of damage. It then becomes an opportunity cost thing. Do you have enough damage that you can get away with it? Sure. So it'd be one of those things of, if you're a Wander, for example, you could use this. You would gain a 39% movement speed for, again, 1.8 seconds. You would gain phasing. You could increase the duration by consuming all your frenzy charges. So it still has quite a lot of downsides in there, and it's not like the longest base duration. Also, Wander's bow builds generally don't get increased duration skill effect on the tree. So it's not like they're going to be having some crazy like 30-second long buff. But if they choose to use this, their next like 5 attacks or however many attacks do 30% less damage. A lot of people wouldn't use it, but some people would use it. And it just adds more options. And it's also one of those things where you could have it so that it doesn't interact well with other movement skills. So during the effect, you can't use other movement skills, something to stop people from using it with shield charge. I don't know. I just feel like phase run, it could be cool, but it currently doesn't really serve a purpose for anything. This is probably my weakest one, but I kind of like it as an idea. Boom. Mirror Arrow. So, why do I mention Mirror Arrow? Mirror Arrow is a really cool skill. People try and make Mirror Blink Arrow Summoners. Mirror Blink Arrow Summoners sort of work in the fact they do a lot of damage, but they have terrible clear speed. It sees some use in PvP, and some people do actually use Blink and Mirror Arrow for like distracting bosses, right? This is kind of like the core, like we kind of want it to be this cool thing. You make decoys of yourself, but nah. So, fires an arrow at the target destination. When the arrow lands, a clone is summoned. The clone is a minion that uses your bow and quiver. It has a base duration, minions do a bunch of damage, and it has a cooldown with 1 charge, right? And again, Blink Arrow is the one which teleports you. Mirror Arrow just makes a clone. I would suggest you make a threshold where instead of making 1 clone, it makes 3 clones, and they all do, say, 30% less damage. Anyone who ever played a Windwalker Monk in World of Warcraft, they had their Storm, Earth, and Fire ability, kind of like that, but for Mirror Arrow. So this might be kind of cool for PvP bros, for the 5 people who do PvP. This might actually make it a half-decent option for people who want, like, the decoy totem style effect of bossing. So that makes it kind of more interesting. It builds more into the kind of like the core fancy of the skill. But more importantly, for that one guy trying to make his Blink Mirror Arrow summoner build work, suddenly, hang on, this is really nice. So you can then use Mirror Arrow once per pack. It still has a 3-second cooldown. You can alternate between Blink Mirror, Blink Mirror, Blink Arrow. But because you have 3 out, suddenly you have substantially boosted map clear. and it would be a single target increase. Basically, it makes it a kind of interesting decoy totem effect for non-summoner builds, and for the one guy who wants to be called summoner builds, it makes it kind of usable without actually changing the core fantasy of the skill, and it still has an opportunity cost of a threshold, so it doesn't just make the skill crazy insane somehow. It opens up more single target options. I think it's kind of cool. Right, Arctic Breath. Arctic Breath technically is fine. Arctic Breath is one of those things where it doesn't have that much of an identity compared to some of the other projectile skills, for example, like Fireball. People say, oh, Arctic Breath, the really laggy thing. So, what does Arctic Breath do? Fires a frozen skull projectile that leaves a trail of ground ice behind it. It explodes on impact, creating more ground ice and damaging targets within an area. Right. What would I do to change the skill? I would literally just make a threshold jewel, which gives you some kind of benefit when you are on the frozen ground. So if we were to jump back over to our two little drawings. So in the current case, if we were to, for example, cast Arctic Breath, you would leave some ice here. We'd hit this monster, then we'd leave ice here. And then if, for example, we had Pierce in this scenario, it would travel through, hit this guy, do an explosion, travel through, do an explosion, travel through, explosion, whatever. And it would leave this cool kind of like trail of ice behind it. You could have a threshold jewel, which either increases the width or just the duration of the ice. And it gives you either a movement speed or a cast speed buff. I'd rather do stuff which is like cast speed or movement speed, just because that way it's kind of a bit more interesting. It's like you do more damage, because damage stuff is kind of boring. And it's just one of those things. It doesn't make the skill suddenly insane, but it gives it some kind of cool, interesting things to it, and just makes people think a little bit differently about how they play. Because it would be one of those things of, again, you could even then suddenly start using it in non-Arctic Breath builds, just to create this trail so you can move a bit faster. I like slipstream style effects, and that's basically what it would do. It'd create a slipstream, and you would move faster on the slipstream. So it'd be kind of a pseudo clear speed increase, assume you can keep killing stuff, without actually making the skill, like, damage-wise more powerful. Options, basically. You're probably noticing a theme here. I'm mostly interested in adding utility skills rather than just, let's just make the skill really awesome. So, Ball Lightning. Now, this is a suggestion a few different people have said, and I've seen this on Reddit. And basically, if you don't know what Ball Lightning does, you fire a slow-moving projectile, it goes bzzz, and it periodically damages enemies in an area around it with its bolts of lightning. The thing which makes Ball Lightning really cool is you shoot this slow-moving projectile. Let's go for this one. So, it goes bzzz. While it's doing that, it's shooting off little tendrils, and it does insane single target if it moves very slowly over a boss, because each of these little tendrils hit it multiple times. But it has this very awkward problem as a skill, where to get the most damage on it, you want it to move as slowly as possible, which then means it does absolutely terrible map clear. And you have to do stuff like Helm enchants to reduce the projectile speed, use gear to reduce the projectile speed. And then what? Are you then swapping out your helmets for map clear? It's not like, oh, I'm just going to swap one gem around. No, it's like, for map clear, are you literally like swapping your helmets and all your gear around? Are you disallocating projectile speed off the tree? It's very awkward. It's a very cool skill, but a very awkward skill. So, a suggested threshold jewel would be that it would gain projectile speed for every non-rare enemy it hits, and then it would lose projectile speed every time it hit a rare or unique enemy. So in this situation, we have, again, Tarke sound effects. Bzzz, 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 and then it kind of like caps out. And you give it like a max travel distance. So it's one of those things you can have going really slow. So again, enjoy the B sound effects. It's probably really annoying. Bzzz, it ramps up. But in this situation, for example, let's say that this is a rare monster, and let's say that this is a rare monster. It would travel through quickly, it would then start going faster, it would then hit this, then start going a bit slower, and then once it cleared through this, it would then start going faster again. And it'd make it one of those kind of interesting things where you still have to balance and think about your projectile speed, but it would make it more usable when it came to raw single target without completely destroying your map clear, and vice versa. And it would make it feel like a very unique skill, because you suddenly have this thing of like, oh, ball lightning, yeah, that's that really like crazy chaotic lightning skill, going into kind of like the theming of lightning, where it's this kind of like uncontrollable thing, where it's just like gaining and losing fucking power and surging. I think it'd be pretty cool. So again, it would kind of like start off going slow, it would then hit a rare mob first, it would then go very, very slow, creeps through, it then hits this, then it starts to go fast again. So it's not like it would suddenly become this insane map clear skill either, because if you hit rare mobs first, it becomes painfully slow, and then in the situation where, for example, these are all normal mobs, and then the rare mob is at the end here, it would like gain ramping movement speed, so much movement speed that when it then hit this mob, I know it's gone in a weird curve, it would only slow back down to its normal movement speed effect. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like, if it normally moves like this, then it goes really fast, and then starts going back to its normal base duration. I don't know, it just makes the skill a bit more interesting without having to touch its core damage numbers, and it's not suddenly going to become, oh, you know, Vile Spark level crazy. Just makes it a little bit more interesting, and that's what we're all about, that hashtag interesting. 2 left. I know this has been a long video. So, Flame Surge. Flame Surge strikes enemies in front of you with a surge of flame. Interesting, I know. Burning enemies are dealt more damage. Flame Surge is a very cool but very awkward skill in the fact that it does this cool little effect where it does more damage against burning enemies, but it has a very awkward hitbox. So if you don't know, it sort of shoots this rather thick, girthy little beam, and that's literally the range on it. It's got this very awkward AoE, and it's just kind of difficult to do much with. So one thing which would just be interesting, and if you look at the proposed split arrow threshold drill they made earlier, they are open to the idea of changing the telegraphs of skills. And again, this, for example, would be a telegraph. So anyone who played Wildstar would know, like, this is a telegraph. If your stuff hits in this space, that is like the telegraph blocked out space of the skill. For example, Cleave hits, you know, in like one of these. Whereas, for example, Sunder hits in one of those. Basically just changing the like targeting reticle or whatever you want to call it. So what I think would be kind of cool for Flame Surge is if you literally just made a threshold which messed with its sort of width and ranges. So you could have it so that it no longer shoots in a normal thing, but then it suddenly, you could have it so that it then shoots in a cone instead. Suddenly this makes it really more interesting. Or you make it a very thin whip-like effect, where it shoots this very thin but long range whip thing. It has a very high cast speed on it, and that can maybe make it kind of interesting, where it's you sort of, it becomes more like a whip, and you sort of whip through mobs. And that's too thick, but you get my idea, right? So instead of being this just like awkward little block rubbish, you make it more usable, and you don't actually change anything about the skill in terms of its numbers or its core mechanics, but you just mess with its targeting, because, yeah, either that or you just give it way more AoE, because all of these AoE skills could be made playable by just giving them really good AoE. So we're down to the last one, Lightning Warp. So you've probably noticed a theme where it's come to addressing movement options, trying to make movement options a little bit more cool. Lightning Warp is an awkward skill. So, cast a delayed teleport to a target destination. When the teleport occurs, lightning damage is dealt to the area around both where the player was and where they teleported to. The quality gives it increased cast speed, you level up, you get reduced duration. The thing which makes Lightning Warp so bad or so awkward to use is it requires 3 to 4 links, you don't get Fortify, and it's basically you're playing a staff build. Because of that, you're playing Lightning Warp. It also has the very awkward fact that you want to be stacking all of this reduced duration, which means that the skill then becomes kind of unusable on any build which takes increased duration. So not only is it just weaker than a lot of movement options in terms of just raw mobility, it's then also incredibly restrictive at the same time, because you cannot use it in a build which has any kind of increased duration. So what would I do to make Lightning Warp a little bit more interesting? again, make it a threshold or whatever, how the GGG decides they want to do these things, is give it a ramping buff style effect. So, for example, here we cast, let's do that again, sorry. So, if you don't know, let's say I want to teleport here. It makes like a little Star Trek holopad thing. After a delay, you go shoot up in the air, and then you land here after a delay. What would be kind of cool is if every time you lightning warped, you gained like a ramping cast speed effect, kind of like a mini arcane surge even. That suddenly makes it really cool, and this isn't completely unheard of. They took cleave and they went, cleave's kind of awkward. What if we gave it a threshold duel where you gain fortify, so you gain the fortify link when you use cleave? You could put arcane surge on lightning warp, so every time you lightning warp, you gain arcane surge, which is like a short, like I don't know, 0.3 seconds, and then every time you do it, it ramps up and up and up. That way, you don't end up just fitting lightning warp into any build. So if you want to be getting like good effect out of this arcane surge or casting whatever you want to make this buff to be, it needs to be something that you're casting more than just once, so it still has an opportunity cost. You also need to remember that it still requires like a 3 or 4 link, it still requires a threshold, and because the way that lightning warp works is by stacking as much less duration on it as possible, the faster you make your lightning warp, the shorter the buff duration it becomes. So it becomes this interesting find the sweet spot sort of thing. So if, for example, you wanted to be someone just like whoring out extra DPS on your character, and it's like, oh, what I'll do is before a boss fight, I'll use a lightning warp thing, you then have to have this really slow lightning warp. So you're then suddenly in the situation of like, oh, I'm doing, you know, a Zaro or Minna, whatever boss shaper, and like, oh, I really need this extra damage. You have this situation where, oh, well, I'll cast one lightning warp early on to the fight to teleport over here, but it's going to take like 2 or 3 seconds to do that. So you get to do some DPS, 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 then you teleport over, you get this buff for a while. It'd be a long buff since you have no restoration in your build. It's really janky. I don't think many people would do it. It'd be mostly just for making map feel more interesting, but it's all about options, and you're then starting to fit lightning warp into your build to get a maybe usable buff. So, yeah, that was a 30-minute long video on a few interesting ways even, sorry Will, that I would make skills slightly more interesting, because I want more interesting skills, or at least more skill diversity. But GGG, to be perfectly honest, you could take basically every single skill I just mentioned and just give it AoE, so that then it hits just like all the mobs, like how they used to, and that could also work too. But yeah, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Let me know if you have any other ideas or skills you'd like to see, if you enjoyed this kind of video, and maybe make more of them. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. Bye-bye. 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 I'm not killing time, so then click on the bye-bye.